Hi everyone, welcome back to Learn and Build Web Application using ASP.NET MVC and Code First Entity Framework video series. In this Lab 12 video, we're going to see about what is Entity Framework and approaches, what are all the different approaches in Entity Framework. And we will see why do we need Entity Framework, why do we need to go for Entity Framework. And also we're going to see what is code first migration approach and why do we need to go for code first migration approach and advantages of using entity framework code first migration approach. Okay, so these are all the concepts that I'm going to cover in this lab 12 video. Okay, now let's begin with entity framework. What is entity framework? Entity framework is an ORM, which is nothing but an object to relational mapping. Okay, so entity framework which does a object to relational mapping, which automatically does a object to relational mapping. So this enables a developer to work with relational data as a domain specific object. And this also eliminates the use of most of the data access plumbing code that developers usually need to write. Like we normally use ADO.NET for storing or accessing the data from the database. Where we use ADO.NET code, where we manually write the code for accessing the database or inserting the database. Okay, so Entity Framework is an enhancement to this ADO.NET that gives developer an automated mechanism for accessing and storing the data. Okay, and developers can also make use of they can write link queries for getting the data from the database using the entity framework. Okay, so developers can also write link queries from the front end itself rather than writing a store procedure in the back end and calling the store procedure. We can write the same queries in the as a link queries from the front end, and we can call the data from the database using entity framework. Okay, and entity frameworks helps us to retrieve and manipulate data as a strongly typed object. Okay, so we can make use of MVC strongly typed views, and also we can take advantage of this strongly typed objects to retrieve and manipulate the data. Okay, so this is about entity framework. Now let us see what are all the different approaches which is present in entity framework. There are mainly three kinds of approaches in entity framework. The first one is like a model first. Okay, in this model first, the database model is created first using the ORM designer tool which is present in the Visual Studio. Once the model consisting of entities and relationships has been designed, the physical database and the class will be auto-generated from the model with the help of entity framework. Okay, now let us see the second approach, that is database first approach. In this database first approach, the database is created first, or we can make use of the existing database, and then the code will be auto generated with the help of this entity framework. Okay, and the final approach is like code first approach. In this code first approach, we can create a set of classes, that is code first. We can create a set of classes in the front end, and then the database will be auto generated by the help of entity framework. Okay, so these are all the approaches, three different kinds of approaches which is present in entity framework. Now let us see why do we need the entity framework, or why do we need to go for entity framework. Basically, in the real world scenarios, there are two types of groups or models present, like logical or storage model, or conceptual or object oriented domain model. Okay. Now, let me tell you about what do you mean by logical or storage data model. Okay. Almost any business application today, okay, has to speak to a relational database. So this relational database can also say it has a backend SQL server. Okay, so it contains all the data. Okay, it contains all the data which is required from the application side. Okay, so this logical or storage model deals with tables, primary key, foreign key, etc. Okay, so this which will be handled by one group of people called as backend team, or this is more towards a database centric. Okay, Now let us see what do you mean by conceptual or object-oriented domain model. Okay, so coming to this conceptual model, applications that are developed which will be completely different from the logical data model or the storage model. Okay, so this object-oriented domain model will be deals with objects, properties, inheritance, polymorphism, etc. So this kind of activities or this type of codings will be done in the front end, and this will be handled by one group of people called as application centric. Okay, so as a result of this above two models, impedance mismatch occurs. Okay, so and developers devote a lot of time and energy in writing a data access plumbing code like ADO.NET for mapping and inserting it into the database. Okay, so we normally use ADO.NET for inserting the data and or accessing the data from the database. Okay, so ADO.NET Entity Framework seeks remedy to this problem by providing the layer of abstraction between the logical data model and the application data model. Okay, so this is why we need Entity Framework. Okay, so this resolves this seeks a remedy to a problem that it eliminates the use of most of the data access plumbing code that the developers usually need to write, where they have to spend more time on this. Okay, so now let us see what is code first migration approach. Before going to code first migration approach, let me tell few points about code first approach. Code first is mainly used in domain driven development, DDD approach. That is, we can focus more on the domain design and start writing the classes based on the domain requirements. Okay, and code first API will create a database on the fly based on the entity class and configuration that we provided in the classes. Okay, so in this code first approach, what we normally do is we'll create a set of classes, and inside these classes where all the set of entities will be present, and we will be uh, start creating the database will be created automatically with the help of entity framework. Okay, and now let me tell you about the code first migration approach. Why do we need to go for code first migration approach? Okay, so code first entity framework 4.2 our previous version. Okay, we need to use some of the database initializers methods. Okay, so there are some of the database initializers method like drop create database when model changes, drop create database always, and create database if not exist. Okay, so these are all the database initializers which we normally need to use when we need to use code first entity framework in the older versions. Okay, so while using this database initializers methods, we need to handle it to seed or maintain the data when there will be a change in the model. Okay, so whenever there is a change in the model, then we need to handle the data. Okay, so because we need to drop and recreate the data whenever there is a model changes occurred. Okay, so code first migration approach came up, where this code first migration approach is very handy when compared to the previous version, because it gave solution to the this problem where we as it will be tracking the changes and handle the model changes smartly without the need of dropping and recreating the data. Okay, so when compared to the previous version, code first migration approach, here in this, if we are using code first migration approach, we no need to drop and recreate the database whenever the model changes occur. Okay, so and also this code first migration allows you to create a new database or update the existing database based on your model classes by using the package manager console which is present in the Visual Studio. Okay, so whenever there is a change in the model changes, then we have to run certain commands in the package manager console. That is like, for example, if you made some changes in the model, like hiding some entity or deleting some entity in the class, then what we have to do is open the package manager console and then execute certain commands like add migration and gives a certain name, and then it will generate the migration file for you, and then finally you update the database. Okay, so you'll be seeing this all this code first migration approach in my practically you will be seeing how can we create this code first migration approach practically you will be seeing in my further upcoming videos, along with the example I will be showing it. So this is about the code first migration approach, and these are all the advantages of using this code first migration approach. Now finally, we shall see what are all the advantages of using this code first entity framework. Okay, so entity framework enables developers to create data access application by programming against a conceptual application model instead of programming against relational data storage schema. Okay, and application can work more in terms of application centric conceptual model, including types like inheritance, complex numbers, and mappings. Okay, so we can work more in terms of application centric, and we can make use of certain concepts like one to many relationship, one to one relationship, many to many relationship, etc. And we can also take advantages of inheritance, complex types, etc. So we can work more in terms of application centric conceptual model rather than concentrating on the data. Okay, so and entity framework is an ORM tool that provides a simple API to perform CRUD operations. And entity framework also helps us to perform certain DDL and DML operations from the front end rather than manually doing it in the back end. Okay, or it also eliminates the use of some of the data access plumbing code like ADO.NET. And entity framework provides strongly typed classes. It gives IntelliSense supports and compile time, errors, and also debugging options is provided for us. And entity framework automatically does the plumbing and mapping for you. So we developers need not to write most of the data access plumbing code that is usually required. Example, ADO.NET. And lot of time is also saved, and it also helps us to develop the application and concentrate more on the business centric details. Okay, so we can concentrate more on the domain related things rather than thinking of how to create a table or how to insert a data. Okay, so we can think more in terms of business centric details, and we can think more in terms of domain related things. Okay, so these are all the advantages of using code first entity framework which I see. Okay, I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please do subscribe to my channel for watching more videos. Thank you.